Welcome back. I'm Judy Teven, Director of Curriculum here at ClassWorks, back with another installment of our MTSS web series. So to recap, we have discussed screening all students, using the data for tier placement, as well as determining tiers and performance levels for each student. And then we discussed a focus on getting started with progress monitoring and meaningful student interventions. So today we are going to take a look at progress monitoring data and talk about what actions need to be taken based on the results that you're seeing. So, okay, what's happening in the classroom right now? All right, students are working independently on their ClassWorks individualized learning, right? Once a week, students are taking their CBM probes. So what does progress monitoring ultimately help you do? The data allows you to see if students are responding to their intervention, right? Lets you know if you need to adjust instruction and if students need to move within the tiers. So I found some great information on the NCII website outlining some rules to use around analyzing data. The rules involve data points and trend lines and work really well with ClassWorks progress monitoring. So I want to walk you through these rules first, and then we'll look at examples of each. So we're going to start with using data points to help guide you with next steps for students. So with data points, you work with the 4-point rule. Now, the new screener data gives us a universal data point that we can and should use to decide, right, if adjustments are needed in a child's progress monitoring session. So before we look at that data and how to use it to make decisions, we want to look at the 4-point rule. Now, this rule or guideline can be used anytime during the progress monitoring session once students have completed at least 4 weekly probes. All right, so it's called, again, the 4-point rule to look at all of those 4 points. So let's look at some ideas. So if all 4 data points are above the goal line, increase the goal. If all 4 data points are below the goal line, make an instructional change of some sort, right? And if 4 data points are above and below the goal line, continue with instruction and data collection. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Here we see all 4 data points above the target rate of improvement. The first data point sets the target, but each of the following represent the trend. So this student's data is an example of the rule that says if all 4 data points are above the goal line, increase the goal. Now, that being said, there is really only one really high data point that is a bit of an outlier. So even for this one, again, we have to use our judgment. I would recommend waiting a couple of weeks to get a couple more additional data points to see if that one was a one-time thing or if the student is really ready to move on. So after a couple more weeks, look at this data again, revisit next steps, one of which might be to increase the goal. Now, in this example, the student is obviously struggling. The rule that we follow here is if all 4 data points are below the goal line, make an instructional change. So your actions may include stopping this set of CBMs and starting a new set at a lower level, and then checking on intervention mastery. Look at that mastery of skills within that intervention and adjust as needed. Now we look at this example, if the 4 data points are above and below the goal line, which means continue with instruction and data collection. So inconsistent data like this may result in a student, be a result of student behavior, or even the time of day that the CBM probe is administered. It's really worth watching this data for a few more weeks before making any decisions. So how can we use trend lines to help us make instructional decisions for our students? So our next set of rules use the trend line and focus on the end goal. So use the trend line in addition to the 4-point rule, or perhaps when you have more data points, maybe toward the end of a 12-week session when there are more data points. So let's again look at some examples. So this trend line shows that there has been a recent downward trend for this student. So it's time to check in with any notes that you can that are attached to the progress monitoring, right? You see that in the progress monitoring results report, and find out if there have been some issues in class or maybe even at home. See what's going on and see if there are some adjustments that can be made at that point. Now, if the lines are close together, a change may not be necessary, right? This student is right on track. And when you're, of course, if you're looking at this and you want to continue reviewing the instructional intervention, pop over to the individualized learning and look for consistency, mastery. Take all of that into account when you're trying to make your next step decision. Really, any of the scenarios that we discussed could involve data reflecting a need to move a student within tiers, right? That's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. Struggling students who move from tier 2 to tier 3 will get an increased intervention time. So more things need to be considered, as well as adjusting their levels of progress monitoring. A student receiving tier 2 support who has a steep upward trend line may be ready to move back to tier 1. And these decisions are made by that student support team. And this is critical to your successful MTSS process. The student support team establishes next steps for students based on data. Reports such as our progress monitoring results report provide all the documentation that you need to support teacher efforts, student behavior, trends in student performance, and instructional changes that need to be made. Now, if changes are needed, it's really easy to stop that current CBM that's in place. And then you're going to want to jump in and set up a new level. And that really brings the students back. They'll have their progress monitoring right there in place, and they never miss a beat. So thanks so much for joining me today. Next time, we're going to discuss those all-important data meetings, those student support team meetings that we were talking about earlier. What are the important elements for meaningful data meetings? We'll discuss reports for documentation and reports for making those important next step decisions. So I'll see you then.